なんかそんなキャラいっぱいいたな。
Now, if only it could get some good sequels out of it. But yeah, for today, we're just going to take a look at some of the clip material that we use for some of our reviews, specifically the shows where they either reference or parody Precure, and give a little more context behind each of them. We'll also analyze other references and parodies that I do at least find entertaining or worth bringing up. Obviously, we won't cover every Precure reference ever because 1, we'll be here all day, and 2, some of them are from shows that I haven't really watched, so I can't really give the full context behind them. And if anything, we also do want to recommend some of these shows, as they are also a ton of fun on their own, and worth checking out regardless. We also won't talk about direct collabs, as those are just the Precure being there with the permission of Toei itself. Weathering With You doesn't just have characters who look like they're cosplaying Cure Black and White, those are Cure Black and White cosplayers, as Toei was one of the sponsors of that film. Also, if any of this sounds familiar, we did bring up this subject matter in the 2 videos we did for Crime Catch Polycare from the Way of the House Husband series. Go watch those videos, as obviously we're not going to be talking about that parody again in this video. With all that in mind, let's just take a quick look at some of my personal favorite Precure references and parodies to welcome in 2024. Starting off, why don't we go back to that first clip from the series Joshiraku. The premise, as the show itself explains, is that it's a very slice-of-life anime about 5 girls who practice rakugo, the art of satirical storytelling in Japan. Basically, they tell some pretty long-winded funny stories that often lead to some sort of comedic punchline. However, since the manga this show was based on was written by Koji Kumeta, the mangaka of Sayonara Zetsubou Sensei, more on that later by the way, it ups the satire once the girls go backstage or go around different locations in Tokyo, including the building of their own publisher. Can't really do satire for something that legit tragic. But yeah, while that first clip with the Cure Dream silhouette came more from a bit where they were talking about how certain mascots tend to use more circles in their designs to be more kid-friendly, like a certain rat that recently entered the public domain, another reference they did back in episode 2 came from a slightly more twisted setup. The segment in question started off with a discussion about vaccinations. For clarification, this anime came out in 2012. It was just a little bit ahead of its time. Fun fact, the luchador here was voiced by Aoyuki, which just makes me think that this was a brief stopover for the little COVID cure. Anyway, the discussion eventually brought up the subject of how pregnant women tend to be higher up on the priority list for vaccinations. Thus, they figured that they could try to simulate pregnancies, and amongst them, Kukuru, the evil chick who we often use for that one needlessly Sakuga moment in the series, not only managed to fake it, but also self-brainwash herself into believing that she was pregnant.
Right.
Thus, her friends tried to relax her a little bit with some very bubbly anime music, which got her to think about some very weeby names for her quote-unquote baby, including Precure, Pikachu, Milky, Horizon, and, Anyway, the segment ended with Kukuru being sent to the happy farm when she realized she didn't have a baby, and yet still believed that she had been pregnant. So yeah, a bit more of an indirect Precure reference that we only really brought up because I want to really recommend this show, as well as the setup for a little later in this video. But whatever, we're just getting started, at least it was appropriate for flu season.
結局優先してもらえたじゃん。違う治療だと思うけどね。
俺を育てたのはキュアグレース。
Hakudo was an anime based on a news app of all things that used some cute anime girls as their mascots, which essentially made them like precursors for the VTubers. Sadly, the app was discontinued in 2019. Regardless, we did get a fun show out of it, with these virtual waifus simply named number 1, 2, and 3, fulfilling odd jobs for their clientele, from working at a convenience store to helping produce an anime, which, yeah, one of those tasks was just a little harder and more soul-draining. But yeah, they also parodied a bunch of anime, including having the final episode do a full-on DBZ parody that, ironically enough, outclassed the actual Dragon Ball show that was airing at the same time. Super was and always will be a mistake. Still, we're not talking about that, but rather the penultimate episode of this series, where their clients were the magical girl lovely Hurt team, who needed the HGs to sub in for them while they were recovering in the hospital. Well, y'all wouldn't be so brittle if you actually worked out in your series proper rather than just saving it up for the movies. Also, how the hell did the show get the okay to bring in Haranishi? Anyway, this anime came out in 2015, which was when Gold Princess was airing, and 1 year after Happiness Charge, hence the lovely part most likely. Though interestingly, they beat Hero Sky to the punch when it came to having the first male cure. Yes, number 3 here was a boy, just ignore that design that was clearly meant to be a girl, and just appreciate his and Astolfo's manliness. Nah, but seriously, Astolfo's the best bro. On that note though, they also seem to have some male fans who were cheering them on whilst demanding they up the violence. Can't relate with that in any way. Also look, a big fan, though same could be said for the villains, who were composed of some more Showa-esque tokusatsu villains with Yahtzee-ish designs, and one of them being a frickin' squid devil. Granted, Precure has used similar characters, especially the latter unfortunately, but then they went into full tokusatsu parody when Hackadol number 4, basically their mid-season cure, came in with all sorts of sound effects directly from Kamen Rider, before she took from a completely different studio than Toei. Sad to say, this is probably the closest we'll ever get to a Precure, Kamen Rider, and Ultraman crossover. Ultimately, they defeated the baddies, but then quickly learned that in spite of their Borat swimsuits, they were actually totally nice guys who earnestly were trying to improve the city, but were being oppressed by the lovely Hurt and their prejudice and need to be heroes of their story. An all too common story in the more recent seasons. Thus, the Hackadolls resolved the conflict by helping both sides and convincing them to settle their differences in the wrestling ring. Well, at least it makes more sense than most AEW storylines. A list of parodies really wouldn't be complete without arguably the South Park of anime that is Gintama. We're not going into too much details as we don't want to use many actual video clips as we've already been copyright claimed by TV Tokyo for the show. Gintama, when it's not legit being an epic space opera with sprinklings of Japanese period dramas, is filled to the brim with parodies of all sorts of other properties, which of course includes Precure. This particular bit came from an episode where the whole setup was that they had completely destroyed the fourth wall and were trying all kinds of different tactics to boost their ratings by seeing what would stick to the wall. Well, that idea alone is already kind of a Precure thing. Though speaking of stuff that sticks to the wall, allegedly, the creators of this anime did have to get permission from several rights holders, in particular Toei, to do these sorts of parodies. And I hope they at least gave them a nice box of chocolates, because oh boy, I don't think anyone was hoping to see the character's landlady Otose and her cat Karen assistant Catherine dress up as the duels of the first 2 series of this franchise, with admittedly really good animation, which honestly just made it all the cringier. Believe me, we're both avoiding copyright claims and saving our eyes, so be thankful and let's just move on. If you followed this channel for a decent amount of time, then you'll know that I'm into Fate Grand Order, even though I know I really shouldn't be. Regardless, I do like this mobile game version of the Fate franchise that will forever remain a Japanese property, at least in this reality, and as such, they would amass a whole laundry list of anime references and parodies. This would result in in-game events like Halloween 2018's Oniland and the introduction of So, a little context. Shuten Doji was a famous ogre or oni in Japanese mythology. Thus, in the Fateverse, they'd of course not only gender bend him into a girl, but also depict her as looking exactly like her VA Aoyuki. Yes, she is a very short woman. She also had a partner Oni named Ibaraki who had been infected by otakudom as she stumbled upon what was heavily implied to be a magical girl anime where, as she put it, girls with scrawny arms managed to fight off much bigger monsters and they had Cure in their names. She then assumed that they had to be based on Shuten's legends since she looked like them, even though, again, this is what Shuten Doji is supposed to look like. Regardless, Shuten ended up playing along with her partner's misconceptions and dressed up as, I guess what she figured was a magical girl, which was as Kintaro. So she was basically dressing up like her boyfriend? I don't know. Also, again, this came out in 2018, 2 years before Healing Good, so you could say this event predicted Aoyuki's future, even though her becoming a Precure was almost inevitable considering her resume. Meanwhile, Ibaraki's VA, Nao Toyama, did have a Precure role beforehand as the Dog Fairy. But yeah, I guess it was appropriate that she play another character who'd pester someone into selling their soul to the Space Bunny. Also, Oniland had the unique touch of some actual voice cutscenes in a game that usually plays out like a visual novel. This is then carried over into a couple of OVAs for Fate Grand Order, Grand Carnival, that were done in a similar style to another fake magical girl, Phantasmoon, who, appropriately enough, was parodying an older toy animation MG. But yeah, apparently within their supposed 758 episodes, they dealt with both their franchise's obsessive use of the Saberface and COVID. Aoyuki's magical girls can never really escape that disease. Before Konosuba, there was Outbreak Company, a series that was a more satirical take on the isekai genre.
I just moved with my freaking...
Something not written by some wannabe MC writers. This show was actually written by one of the best Sentai writers ever, actually. It featured the Japanese government, led by an otaku named Shinichi, trying to sow favor with a traditional fantasy world by introducing anime and manga to them, which makes absolute sense to me. Yeah, it was a fun little series, parodying and commentating on otakudom, all as a means to bring real culture to a very racist society. So yeah, while this was generally a more easygoing slice of life show that showed what makes anime great, it did get pretty heavy with the Holy Elden Empire being a bit of a cesspool full of discrimination on all sides. And one of the worst perpetrators unfortunately came from the top in the form of their monarch, Petralka. Yeah, apparently this anime was toned down from the original light novels it was based off of. Thankfully though, Petra did go through some character development, and her kingdom started to move in better directions thanks to anime, but still, she did kinda deserve some good old karma. And hey, did you notice that her voice sounded just a little familiar? In the 10th episode, they decided to make their own version of Madoka Magica's Rebellion film that actually came out a couple of months before this episode aired. However, for whatever reason, they also decided to throw in another series while they were at it. Funny thing is that Urobuchi admitted that he had been influenced by Precure, and had he seen Hardcat sooner, he might have given Madoka a bit more of a happy ending. So maybe this is what would have happened if he saw Doki Doki. But yeah, this whole scene was just comedy gold, as not only did Petra get her comeuppance, but also, all of her lines here were almost word for word Alice's debut as Cure Rosetta from the 4th episode. Only major difference was that they had Mai Fujigami read these lines a lot more awkwardly this time, leading to some grade A cringe comedy. Obviously, this wasn't in the original light novel, and was more likely writer Naruhisa Arakawa taking notice of the cast list, and decided to throw in an homage to the other company he frequently worked at. It's actually pretty clever stuff, and just further proof that we need to let this man write some Precure stat. Because really, what better depicts the fandom than stuff like this? So, unless you actually believe a certain YouTuber who uses the crowd from Moana as their PFP, then you'll know that My Dress Up Darling isn't just some fan-servicey rom-com. It's actually a great send-up to how passionate cosplayers can get when it comes to dressing up as their favorite characters, including designing the best costumes they can, and really getting into their source material. The female lead Marin was especially into magical girl anime, and while the original manga only really showed little bits and conceptual pieces of her favorite show, Flower Princess Blaze, including a line about them using their fists rather than magic, the anime adaptation just went full ham and threw in all of the references along with Precure. For instance, while this rival character named Shion just kind of looked like Onpu Segawa from Ojamajo Doremi, they just straight up turned her into Onpu, going as far as to even bring in her original VA, Rumi Shishido, to, I think, try to do her old voice, but she was clearly struggling to do it.
私は他のプリンセスなんかと一緒にいたくないの。お仕事で欠席や早退することもあると思うけど、仲良くしてくださいね。
But yeah, other Precure specific references include their transformation sequence just being straight up hard catch, and these foot soldiers looking very Choyarkish. For good measure, they also of course threw in some Madoka with a clearly evil mascot character. Meanwhile, the main character of this show was voiced by Sakura Tange of Cardcaptor Sakura fame, and they showed a relationship chart that looked almost as complicated as the one from that show. But yeah, definitely one of the more impressive parodies we've seen so far, with some great animation, and a bit of a legit story to it that actually makes me want to see a spin-off. I mean, at least these girls throw more fists than the current shows. We'll wrap things up with legit one of my favorite comedy anime of all time that just so happens to have one of the best Precure parodies on multiple levels, which is kind of ironic considering the main theme of the show. Sayonara Zetsubo-sensei was about a very pessimistic high school teacher named Nozomu who always tried to act like he wanted to commit Sudoku, but was really more of a poser than anything else. Regardless, it led to a lot of comedic adventures with his class, as they made some very sharp commentary about Japanese culture in general, not just anime. And as we mentioned earlier, Koji Kumeta wrote this series along with Joshiraku, and thus it had a very similar tone and possibly a similar love for the magical girl genre. Yeah, while I'm not totally sure if he had a direct hand in writing both of these segments, the fact that his other anime called Kakushigoto featured the title character, who was basically just Nozomu as a mangaka, drew some very Precure-esque illustrations, makes me believe that at least wasn't just a coincidence. Also, these characters were called the Polycure, which is funny because they don't look like cops. All that said, Lily Cure here was one of the best parodies by not only featuring a very appropriate title for a Precure parody, considering Lily's, or Yuri, is pretty much ingrained into this franchise, but the special opening for this episode was really well done. Animated by Satoshi Yamaguchi, a key animator for another one of my favorite properties, and Spy Family, it had some of the best visuals for what was otherwise a fairly laid-back slice-of-life comedy. From smacking around a much larger monster, to using the freaking Konami code to win the day, the sequence had everything, including a legit fantastic song. Like, seriously, look up Lily Cure Go Go if you want to hear a real banger. Granted, the more chibi designs of these characters, Chi, Kafka, and Meru, do lean more towards Moetan than traditional Precure. For reference, this episode from the second season of this show aired not too long after the second season of Yes 5, so we still weren't even getting some of the more stylized designs of Hardcatch just yet. Still, it did end up getting the themes down pat, with characters fighting an actually evil version of Nozomu, obsessed with spraying despair across the land, which is a bit too common of a theme with this franchise now that I think about it. And interestingly, Chiri, who by the way, real first blue lead here, was voiced by Maina Inoue, who would go on to play Now, aka Cure March a few years later for Smile Precure. There, she'd again fight clowns obsessed with spraying despair, though guys like Joker were actual serious threats, while even as a supervillain, Nozomu was still... Also, again with mixing the toy animation magical girls. Though surprisingly, this one-off parody did seem to end on a happy note, with Nozomu being freed from whatever evil despair curse had been placed on him, and he and Chi walked off into the sunset, until a sudden and unneeded sequel struck that undid their perfectly good happy ending. Again, why is it that these parodies have to be accurate in the worst ways possible? But yeah, that's all we have for today. Again, there was a lot more we could have covered, but these were just examples that stuck out to me. That said, what are some of your favorite Precure references and or parodies, or hell, just magical girl refs in general? Feel free to leave them in the comments, and if this video takes off, we might do it again sometime. For now though, we do have to finish up another actual Precure series, along with doing an overview for that one sequel that we took more than a few jabs at. Look forward to it, and until next time though, for now my friends, Happy New Year, and if you'll excuse me, I'm just gonna go eat some mochi.